Welcome to the Thematic Edge podcast. I'm Marvin Barth of Thematic Markets, and I'm joined today by my usual co-pilot, Mark Farrington of the Global Watchtower. In this episode, we analyze the situation in the Persian Gulf. How should we interpret recent events? Where are we going? And what does that mean for markets? Importantly, given the fast pace of developments, we recorded this at noon London time on Monday, the 13th of April, following the breakdown in peace talks between the U.S. and Iran that took place in Pakistan over the weekend, and the imposition of a U.S. blockade on Iranian ports and ships. While there is a lot of common ground between Mark and I, we do have quite different views on key aspects of the path forward and what their implications are for markets. So this discussion was, shall we say, rather spicy. Mark laid out what his view of the blockade means and how it fits into his theory of a U.S. de-escalation from what has been the most intense bombing campaign in history to one that becomes a maritime exercise to reopen the Gulf and put international pressure on Iran. We discuss how the U.S. is shifting responsibility to other nations, especially allies, to increase common responsibility for the seas. And we discuss how various allies, particularly the Gulf Arab countries, Europe, and Asia, are likely to respond to this. I posited my view that the U.S. strategy is one of denial of sovereignty, that ultimately this is about regime change by making it impossible for the current government, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to maintain internal control and thus lead to its collapse. This doesn't require invasion, and it most certainly doesn't involve nation building. Indeed, I believe the Trump administration sees a failed state or Iranian civil war as acceptable, though not necessarily desired outcomes. On those points, Mark and I largely agree. Where we disagree is the extent to which the U.S. de-escalation can hold if the Islamic Republic, like a cornered, wounded animal, lashes out at Gulf Arab states' oil infrastructure. We also debate whether or not the Trump administration needs a resolution of the war by the U.S. midterm elections in November. We then turn to what these scenarios mean for the global economic outlook and for the U.S. political outlook, both of which feed into our views of the market outcomes. While Mark and I largely agree on many of the economic and relative asset price implications, we find ourselves at odds again over the implications for the dollar. Before we jump in, let me remind you that our discussion is for information purposes only, that nothing we say should be considered to be investment advice, and that you need to do your own research, and that your investment decisions are your own responsibility. With that, please enjoy this episode of the Thematic Edge podcast. Welcome, Mark. Let's go ahead and get started here. We've got a lot to talk about. You and I haven't had a conversation mano a mano about things in a while. We've had a lot of really interesting guests, but there's been a lot going on. Most importantly, and I think it's, important to recognize we're speaking on the 13th of April, because by the time that we release this on Wednesday, who knows what will have happened by then. But as of noon London time, on the 13th, Monday, the 13th of April, this is where we stand. Why don't you kick it off? How do you see the situation in terms of where we are now, the breakdown of the ceasefire talks? We still have the ceasefire in place, but the peace talks have failed. President Trump has announced this blockade. CENTCOM has clarified that that is a blockade of Iranian vessels or anybody who tries to pay Iran for
Yeah.
transit, but everybody else is free to go through. How are you reading the situation? What does this mean in a big picture to you, and where do you see us going?
Okay, sure. Thanks for that, Marvin. Good to see you again. Yeah, I think that the ceasefire was a predictable interval to change the momentum that was in train during the bombing campaign, and we were within that time frame of 4 to 6 weeks that Trump and Hegseth and others were promoting. But it was clearly not a ceasefire based on a convergence of views between the IRGC and the US. So it was destined to end with no deal. But I think that the blockade move is an intelligent one. I know I've been writing in my Global Watchtower the past couple of weeks about.
Can I interrupt you and ask you a question about that? So, if it was not based on any convergence of views, and understandable, obviously things broke down. What got us to the ceasefire in the first place? Because it takes two to tango. The U.S.
Yeah.
can't just announce. In fact, the U.S. actually had bombers in the air. They were actually the bombers in the air were actually refueling at the time that the ceasefire announcement came through. So, what was it that changed on the Iranian side that got them to come to the table?
Well, from the Iranian side, it was just relief from, probably what will go down in history as the most intense bombing campaign ever. For the US, I think it was, as Trump and other members of the cabinet stated, they'd have achieved 99% of their objectives. It was they understood from their allies that most would not be able to contribute to any kind of maritime operation until there was a ceasefire in place. And so there was a need, the 4 to 6 week window had come and they needed to effect a ceasefire. Iran, you know, was I think convinced that they could agree to a ceasefire without appearing to have submitted or surrendered, and that was all that mattered to them because this is going to be a long, drawn out conflict. And there will be many intervals. So this is just the first one. So I didn't read it as some grand ceasefire event, rather just say, okay, let's all take a break here and move on to the next step. And that suited Iran as much as it did the US and Israel.
Okay. So, yeah, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but continue where you're going. I wanted to better understand that point.
Yeah, so okay, I rightly pointed out. So they managed to get the ceasefire event. It was destined to not deliver that much, but it's still in place, as you said. And now we moved to the first aspect of what I've been calling phase two, which is the US's attempt to alter the narrative on this war as no longer being a massive bombing campaign, but a maritime conflict in the Persian Gulf. And using the blockade method is intelligent. It helps them to continue to enforce the sanction regime, which they have on the Iranian regime, and also encourages the rest of their allied and partnered nations to begin to send ships to this global choke point and help to escort commercial and merchant fleets through a difficult space. The UN has passed a resolution to validate and provide them the international legal cover that they need. The ceasefire is in place, so all the preconditions have been put in place for the allies to now respond, not joining the war with the US, but delivering a maritime escort within the framework of international law. So the blockade is the role that the US will be playing. Now we'll see what roles the other nations play. I suspect Japan will bring the minesweepers and other surveillance, seacraft, and then we'll see what the French and the British can deliver to the area. But I do think we'll get a response now from the world because we do have a ceasefire, a UN resolution, and the US having halted the bombing campaign.
So you see that ceasefire is holding then.
I doubt it. Like you saw, even with Israel bombing Lebanon and Iran, still bombing GCC countries immediately after the ceasefire. Some, violation levels are being tolerated, and they will probably continue to be tolerated. I think what is called a ceasefire right now will eventually be just described as the U.S. offensive bombing campaign has been wound down. Doesn't mean that the U.S. will not respond with, aggressive, punitive bombings to any kind of terrorist attack or maritime attack, but we're not going to go back to where we were, 2 weeks ago. And so, if you call that a ceasefire, we're going to have a ceasefire.
So then what exactly is the U.S. objective here?
Well, I think the U.S. would describe most of its objectives of having already been achieved. I prefer to use, Secretary of State Rubio's phraseology rather than Trump's, because Trump, has many motives when he speaks. And Rubio has described the elimination and degrading of all the conventional capability of Iran so that it does not have the protective cover to engage in a covert nuclear program. That has been achieved. And also by eliminating all of the conventional
And
capability.
by cover, you basically mean that, having effectively the conventional force ability to rain fire down upon all his neighbors, such that it was seen as sufficiently painful for anyone to stop them from developing nuclear weapons. So this is basically the North Korean technique that we can turn Seoul into a sea of fire with our hardened artillery just across the border. So you can't touch us while we develop nuclear weapons. Iran was basically doing the same thing by building up this ballistic missile and drone capability.
Absolutely. That's a perfect way to describe it. I think Israel, if it had been left on its own, would have done the best it could, but no other nation in the region was going to attempt to take out Iran's covert nuclear weapons program. So Israel really needed the U.S., and so the U.S. has come in and done that. But
Wait a
it's
second. Are you saying that the U.S. did this because Israel asked them to, and that the U.S. is just an agent of Israel?
no, what I'm saying is that there was a regional problem, and that there was only one nation within the region that had the capability to strike, and even on its own might not have been sufficient. And so the US, to neutralize this regional risk, which had global repercussions, joined in the strike as it did last year when the first bombing campaign was undertaken. But the point being, which I think is has not been as well understood globally, is that taking out the conventional strike capability was just as important as bombing the silos deep in the mountainsides, because taking out the convention capability exposed them and basically leveled the playing field with all of its regional neighbors there. And so, if the U.S. were to walk away now, the regional powers have sufficient strength to constrain and restrain Iran going forward on their own. So those objectives are achieved. And so I think now the U.S. really needs to transition this just to a maritime issue. It's now about getting the straits open for business. It's about having the world take responsibility for its own, dependencies that is sort of again irrationally built up in a geographic choke point, etc. And in order for the U.S. to make that transmission, it needs to stop with the bombing campaign and focus only on the naval and maritime aspect of the mission.
So, um, is that possible though? Because I mean, there's this classic line, the enemy gets a vote.
Yeah.
And so, I think this is sort of my problem with that scenario is that it seems to suggest that the US is in full control of the situation. And I'm not debating the point that the U.S. has more control over this situation than Iran does in many ways. I think, all these people were saying the U.S. is losing, doesn't have a strategy, whatever. I just don't think they're paying attention. Like, it's very clear to me there's a U.S. strategy here, and I think I'll probably articulate it slightly differently than you, and we can get to that. But
Yeah.
just directly to your point,
Yeah.
you now have an Iranian regime that is degraded significantly,
Yeah.
um, and is going to effectively be strangled by a blockade. And I see them as very much a wounded animal in a corner at this point. So they understand that the end game here is the end of the Islamic Republic. That is sort of the intent, I think, from my perspective of what the U.S. is trying to achieve, what the other Gulf Arab states want, what Israel wants, what all the parties that are aligned against them want is this is the end of the Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
And in that state, why would they not reach out? And they still have apparently ample capacity to launch missiles, drones that are still in storage and attack, desalinization plants across the Gulf states in Israel, attack oil infrastructure there. Like, the potential for significant escalation in this, I think, is still there. And if you believe that Iran has that capacity, then it makes sense that the job is not finished for the U.S. in that sense. So what makes you so confident that we are sort of getting to just a maritime exercise at this point?
Well, I would make the point that this is going to be the U.S., what I believe to be the U.S.'s objective. We haven't
Okay.
arrived there yet. This is Monday morning, day after the ceasefire, and the U.S. has only just announced the blockade. But the U.S. can only control its actions. It cannot control what Iran does. So what I'm saying is U.S. will now attempt to begin to control its actions by emphasizing the maritime objective, not emphasizing the 10,000 hit list that it's had for its bombing campaign for the last month. So it will be pushing forward a narrative around free and open merchant traffic through the Persian Gulf. That will be on message. Iran then responds to those circumstances, and what you just cited are some obvious choices. I think that there has been this narrative that the GCC countries have just been left exposed and that the US has abandoned them and that they're somehow going to be replaced by the Chinese as the power of influence. So for me, this stuff couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, what the US has just showcased in terms of military offensive capability has just been awesome. And there's a pipeline of military orders from the GCC countries already, and they continue to be validated through the conflict. And if you look at the success rate of defending against incoming missiles and drones, it's in the 90s. It's 90%. It's as high or higher than Israel and better than Ukraine. So whatever defense is currently deployed in the GCC countries is working incredibly well, and they're going to be a satisfied customer. So we're dealing with a scenario that if Iran continues to lob bombs into GCC just because it's not getting its way on a blockade in the Straits of Hormuz, they're clearly the aggressor in this case, and they're clearly violating international law. And the GCC nations will have to take control of the narrative and encourage the world to come and support them. And they will have to rely on this defensive shield, which they have been relying on through the worst part of the war. So it's a manageable risk. It's not a pleasant one. And Iran will do its best to exploit it. But I think, that's a different level of, high alert than we were 2 weeks ago. It is a lower level of conflict.
I can see that. I again have some differences, but before I come to those,
Yeah.
um, let's go through this point about because I think there is an area here where we probably both agree on this maritime strategy, which is that the Trump administration is effectively calling on all its other regional partners, alliances, whatever, that hey, you guys need to step up and take responsibility for this too. This is not just a U.S. issue. We may have initiated the war, and I think this is something that you see to your point in the press all the time that, well, the US created this problem. No, the problem existed before. The US just showed the problem existed by creating, by
Yeah.
trying
Iran
to
could
go
have,
in and solve it, right?
yeah, Iran could have
Okay.
closed the strait any day it wanted to.
And, to the earlier point about it building overwhelming conventional capacity, it probably was headed in that direction. Who knows? Maybe we're wrong on that. But the key point is now that we're here, the U.S. is effectively saying, "Look, this is a problem, and you guys all have to participate in dealing with this because this is more of a problem for you than for us." And we are starting to see, we saw even before the ceasefire that the UAE had committed to join the U.S. in the war. Um, we're seeing all the other Gulf states effectively decide, hey, we're going to start cooperating on helping free the straits. Just before we came on, I saw an announcement. The Australians have also committed to this. Um, you mentioned the Europeans before. I mean, they have been less straightforward in their support, but there's also a real capabilities issue. I think this has been highlighted by the Royal Navy. They had one destroyer that was available that they could send to Cyprus, and it had to turn around halfway because it had a problem. And then we
Yeah.
have the East Asian allies, Japan, and you've written about that. So can you go into how you see this maritime activity playing out? Like, what is your view of how it is actually going to play out, and what are the objectives of the Trump administration in creating this?
Okay. In the last piece that I published for the Global Watchtower, I started with the the history of votes in the UN Security Council because I think that showcases, the way this should play out in European capitals and in North Asian capitals, and not so much in the US, but elsewhere, because historically these countries which had prerequisites of a UN Security Council resolution and ceasefire in place, etc., they had a adherence to international law. That was their mission. It was not about judging whether the creation of the problem was right or not. It's that there is a problem, and if we want to intervene in this problem, we have to adhere to international law. That has now all been laid out. And if you now don't respond, you're basically undermining your own principles, saying that I'm not going to adhere and support international law because I'm so angry at Trump for starting this conflict when it was really inconvenient for us because, we're energy dependent, our economies are struggling, etc. So I think the response will come grudgingly and complaining and kicking and screaming. It will come from Europe and from North Asia. They will send the resources that they have. They will try to emphasize that they're doing it under their own justifications, that the circumstances must be right, but they're there to protect their own flagged ships on a freedom of navigation mission. And so I think we'll see over the course of the next month and a half this convergence of behavior globally, almost regardless of what the US and the Iranians do to each other. Like I said, they will probably still be engaged in some level of conflict, but lower intensity. What will be consistent is this convergence of behavior globally on the maritime issue that has been kind of tried and tested over time, and there's a history of UN Security Council votes to show it. And the vote was unanimous. It was the Russians and the Chinese vetoed a second resolution, which was more aggressive, calling for a multinational force to collaborate together, which they couldn't accept because, as the Chinese representative said, it would put a veil of legitimacy on Trump's, illegal war. So it was. I even think the Chinese will come to participate in some manner. And as with all wars, it's an opportunity to set precedents and to test capabilities. So I think, as I wrote, the Japanese will be there and setting a precedent important for the revisions that they have planned for self-defense force laws in the future. China may be there to set a precedent under what circumstances they may be willing to collaborate in the future, etc. So I think once it becomes a maritime issue, it changes the whole dynamics of the board, and the U.S. and Iran are not the only players anymore, and you can see people justifying actions that will not lead to peace, but lead to some level of certainty and predictability beyond what we just experienced in March. And for me, that's the kind of relief rally that I've tried to position for. And I can see playing out over the second quarter, but I will, be ready for it to all go pear-shaped in a moment's notice if Iran, as I know you believe, reacts in a quite desperate way and just lashes out and tries to provoke a response. So, we have to basically also price risk assets for that risk and that probability too.
Well, I mean, look, that's we should transition to how markets react. But I mean, I guess the difference that I have are not hugely different on substance and ultimate aims, but I do think, one, I do think the U.S. has had a strategy since the beginning. This is what I suspected, and increasingly, I just look at all their actions, and a lot of this is probably confirmation bias, I think. But it's hard for me to explain all the different things that they've done militarily and otherwise as anything other than what one of the sort of military analysts I like to follow has written about this fellow Big Surge on Substack,
Yeah.
that this is effectively an insurgent campaign from the outside. That an insurgency tries to remove a government's ability to govern. And so it says if we're not going to be able to take control, we're going to remove your ability to control governance. And what the air campaign that they are attempting to do, and it's been specifically targeting not just their military infrastructure, but indeed, and they've explicitly said this, the assets of control of the state and their economic assets, and basically creating a collapse of the functioning of the state itself, so that at some point it is impossible for the Islamic Republic of Iran to exist,
Yeah.
or
No,
to
this is,
to rather to govern Iran, right?
yes. Yes. Complete sovereignty is impaired.
Yes. And to me, that is a strategy. And by the way, I think it's a damn clever strategy.
No, it's absolutely true. Treasury Secretary Bessent made it clear in his public statements that even before the kinetic phase of the conflict, they had already put financial sanctions on Iran and were blocking accounts and tracing, crypto transfers because they were already economically trying to degrade the Iranian regime. So I totally agree. This was a holistic regime change strategy. But I
From the
think
get-go, I would argue,
that,
do not pay attention to all the crazy rhetoric coming out of President Trump's mouth, as you
yeah,
said earlier. And I wrote a piece on this as well. That like he's speaking to lots of different audiences at once, and
yeah,
all of them he's trying to obfuscate things. So a lot of things come out that are self-contradictory. And this isn't four-dimensional chess. It's none of that. It's just
yeah,
the guy, the analogy I've used is he's like a card mechanic, a close-up magician with cards, is that
yeah,
you never see the trick coming because they've distracted you.
yeah,
You
yeah,
don't
yeah,
see the distraction.
yeah.
He is
It's a good analogy.
he is really, really good at this.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to think of President Trump, what you don't have to accept that he's, this amazing genius. You don't have to accept that he's got this playing four-dimensional chess as we referred, but you do have to accept the guy is really good at distracting people
No,
and getting.
absolutely. People don't understand. He's been around the halls of power his entire life as a very successful businessman. So while he is not a trained politician, he's observed every politician's tricks over the years. He knows how the game is played, and he's pretty good at playing it and disrupting it, you know.
So I would say this has been the strategy from the beginning, and I guess that's where I potentially disagree with you on some of these things. Is that one? I do think that the Iranian regime, and I think one of the ways to interpret what the ceasefire was. I think there are a lot of different reasons for the ceasefire. I think you made some very compelling points, and they don't. They can be mutually reinforcing as to why you go there and do that. They don't know it can't. It's not just that it's this one or that one. A lot of
Exactly.
them are reinforcing, and I think one of them was one of the problems the U.S. faces in this scenario. Because this is a novel form of warfare. I mean, what Big Surge is highlighting is that this is novel. Nobody's ever done this before.
Exactly. This is
You've
important.
got you've got this political scientist Pape. Well, I can't remember his first name at the University of
Pape.
Chicago. Who's at uh,
No. Pape, you're right, Professor Pape.
who's out there saying, I've analyzed all the numbers and no air campaign has ever been successful. And I'm like, did you, by the way, pay attention to Afghanistan? It was actually a very successful campaign. Yes, you had some limited ground force usage on but it actually did overthrow the Taliban. It was the nation building that came afterwards that was the failure.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that is what I think is the role here. They're never going to go for nation building. They don't care. They're like, this has been what I've said all along, that they are perfectly happy to leave a completely non functioning state in a state of civil war, even if
Yeah.
that is their downside scenario. They would obviously prefer something else. They would prefer a Venezuelan scenario. They would prefer a scenario where the people in Iran rise up. All of those are things they would prefer to happen. But their downside case is we leave a non functioning, complete collapse state there that will never be a threat to anyone again. And also, by the way, is not going to have the ability to exert force across the Gulf. So the Gulf starts working again. And if part of the ceasefire, I think, was because it's hard for people to believe that. I mean, if you look at certainly the Western press, which is very anti-Trump, did not want to accept this, still says there's no strategy, still says,
Yeah.
we don't know what's going on here. All his language is inappropriate. And then you have the whole other scenario that people think that it's all about taco. Trump always chickens out. So
Yeah.
he will back down and he can't take the economic pain of this.
Yeah.
And if you look at the Iranian rhetoric, now, whether this was just propaganda on their part to feed into the Western press or not, but I think it does suggest they, to some extent, bought into those two narratives, right?
Yeah.
Well, we can outlast the US.
Yeah, absolutely. They did.
And and they can't take the pain of this economic threshold. And I think part of the ceasefire was for the US team to sit across the table from them and say, this is where we're going, and we're serious about it, and we're not backing down. And yes, we can take the pain. And no, we're not going to invade. We're just going to make sure you can never rule.
Yeah.
And
I think there's an interesting point right there, which is poorly understood, at
well,
least in the first.
can I just finish
Yeah, go
complete
ahead,
the point
finish it.
there, which is
Yeah.
just that, and then you come out with the blockade and you say, hey, one is that it does go to your maritime strategy, and I would say it's consistent with that. I'm not denying that, but I think it also is very clearly says to everybody, we can take the pain. We're happy to double down here on exactly this problem and incre- emphasize this is the rest of the world's problem, not our problem. So you in Tehran have to understand we're willing to go all the way. That's one of the ways I read this. And so go ahead.
I was just going to say that this issue about staying power, I think, is so poorly understood. And I'm going to use a Venezuelan analogy here because I think it's relevant. Now, the US built the blockade first in the case of Venezuela and sat off the coast for 3 months. That was their staying power. And then they waited and they waited and then they did their surgical strike. In the case, and also the Caribbean is their own backyard. They didn't need international collaboration. They completely control freedom of navigation in the Caribbean. Now you move not the same playbook to the Persian Gulf, but you move the same toolkit to the Persian Gulf. And what the U.S. has is it did the surprise strikes first to catch Iran off guard and to cut off the head of the leadership. And now it wants to devolve the kinetic war to the blockade strategy. Why? Because from the blockade strategy, this is where the US has staying power. The whole attrition argument against the U.S. is it can't stand the pain of having troops on the ground and economic confidence being impacted for long periods of time. But it can sit offshore in its ships for months. That is not a high paying threshold. And so the U.S. is in a sense doing the reverse strategy. It wants to get back to the blockade now where it has staying power. And unlike the Caribbean, it does need international collaboration. And that's why it will reframe the message as a maritime issue because it does want collaboration from the rest of the world. But otherwise, the toolkit, which was revealed in the Caribbean Sea and in Venezuela, is on display in the Persian Gulf, but adjusted for the circumstances of what they're facing there, very far from the U.S. shore and a space where they need international collaboration.
So I guess that's where I think we come to our potential difference here. So I think we both largely agree with what the sort of strategy and all of that is, and that they're overlapping, and we may have some slight differences of emphasis on individual points within there. But if you accept that the Iranians have now taken that message or will soon receive that message, internalize that message, then that's my whole caged animal argument that
Yeah,
or trapped wounded animal in the corner,
yeah,
because they understand that the Islamic Republic understands that the end state here is their death and destruction,
yeah,
and their only plays are to disrupt the US strategy. So they can't allow it to be this stable de escalation. And I do think there is a very high likelihood that they lash out, that they try and attack the Arab states. I think that's actually even more likely than them attacking ships, frankly, because then they're actually attacking, to your point, all the people around the world who are their audience and also in many cases their patrons, like the Chinese,
hmm,
who want those ships to go in and out. But um, you know, I do think there's a real risk that they start attacking the Arab oil infrastructure, water desalination. This is a real serious. This turns this into a much more serious event in my sense. The other is that, to your point of staying power, I agree with you, and this has been always the I go back to even in first term Trump, something that a couple of different insiders at the time told me is that while Trump probably wouldn't be able to explain it in these terms, he was a natural offshore balancer, right?
Yeah,
Use your gunboats offshore to control the situation onshore. Don't
yeah,
go in and invade like the US did in 1990 and
yeah,
2003 and all these things.
mm,
And but my concern here in terms of staying power is the election coming up.
yeah,
And I do think that this being an unresolved situation going into November is a problem for Trump and the Republicans. So the reverse of what all the taco crowd thinks, that they think he needs to back away. I think if he does that, election is gone.
yeah,
The Republicans will get slaughtered in both houses if this was all for nothing.
mm,
And if it is just a standoff by November, I think it's still very threatening to a loss of both houses, because it still looks like the narrative that the press is telling you now. Well, we had free navigation before. You screwed it up. It's all your fault,
yeah,
right? Whereas if they can bring about the collapse of the Islamic Republic before November, that is their one hope for actually turning, a sow's ear into a silk purse, so to speak.
yeah.
So
I
I don't
look.
know how you think about that.
No, I think you're right that having a collapse of the Islamic regime is the one scenario that just delivers victory and will pay some dividends at an election in 2026, etc. I just don't think that scenario is on the cards, and I think that Trump and his team around him understood that when they took it on in March. So unlike everyone else who believes that he's reactive and impulsive and doesn't have a strategy, I don't accept that. The guys around him are too serious and they articulate a strategy so well, it's not possible that this is running, half-cocked. So I think that they accepted the risks. They accepted that this may impact midterms. I think that if I'm Trump and his campaign team, I would have been woefully disappointed by the Republican Party already. They have been so ineffective in translating this majority into narrative control. They're constantly on the defensive. I mean, it's just obvious the Democratic Party, combined with the sort of European echo chamber, which exists out there, as well as the Canadian one, that they hands down beat the Republican Party on the narrative management because they're just relentless. They just never give up. I mean, the fact they couldn't pass the SAVE Act and various things like this, they're just not firing properly domestically as a unified party. And I think probably Trump said, well, look, that's not my problem. I can't control them. I can influence them, but I can't control them. And I've got agendas that need to be achieved. And so I think they just made the calculation and say, we're going to do this now because the opportunity and the window is there. We're going to do our best to get it back on track in time for the domestic agenda that we have from June to November. If it produces a positive outcome, backslap to us. If not, that was a risk we needed to take. So I don't think the election is driving him one-dimensionally. I think it's a major, major factor, but I think his inability to get more results out of the Republican Party has probably been discouraging. So I think he's very much focusing on his administration, his term, and getting as much done as he can. He'll never give up. I think he'll campaign like hell all the way up to November, but he's not going to give up just because the Iran conflict didn't have a neat, tidy ending to it on timeline. So I think they have to stick to the strategy. They
Okay,
moved.
I think we agree on that. We're
Yeah.
going to run out of time if we don't move on.
Okay.
Let's but address the fact that again, the classic line, the enemy gets a vote. So,
Oh yeah.
the more important disruptors to you are, Iran, and also don't forget about Israel.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for bringing us back to that point because I was going to make a point. Again, for me, this is where the Venezuela episode is useful. Like I said, not the same playbook, but the same toolkit. In the case of Venezuela, you apparently had the connection with Delcy Rodriguez before the attack, and so there was some group that the U.S. could work with, and then start the timeline for a regime change. And that is a regime change with a final goal of democracy, and they're allowing even 1 or 2 years for that to play out. So I think in the case of Iran, it's the same thing. I don't think they have found, or at least they haven't revealed to us yet, who their counterparty is in Iran that they hope will replace the Iranian regime. I don't think it's the Speaker of the Parliament. He doesn't speak like someone who's interested in collaborating. So I think there's a long-term acceptance of a gradual regime change. And how that plays out is probably not totally in control of the U.S. So the objective is to reduce that as the dominant narrative out there. And how that plays out, you don't have very much control over. But if it turns south, like you're suggesting, then that's a risk. That's a risk that we have to price into the financial markets because that does imply this energy shock lasting all year. This implies a confidence hit to U.S. Risk assets because now there's fear of just exactly what you said, which is the U.S. Or the Republicans lose both the House and the Senate in the midterms, etc. All of that's going to get priced in. So I think there's a narrative battle, and then there's what's actually happening on the ground. I feel pretty confident on what's happening on the ground. The U.S. is going to move into a phase two framework and begin to define this as a maritime strategy and do their best to get the narrative off the front pages being about the war and about other things and get it back to a domestic agenda by June. So this second quarter for me is pivotal in terms of keeping animal spirits alive and the risk appetite that's backing this equity rally, which is what I think helps prop up the economy.
Well, so let's swing to markets there because and by the way, I mean that if we turn to a war on infrastructure, which again I think in my mind is a higher probability than what I'm reading from you, just because I think that's where Iran will end up needing to go, but let's look at the different cases. So let's take your base case scenario first. How does this play out in terms of effect on economies, risk assets, or risk appetite, and how that translates to different risk assets, both on a generalized basis, i.e., a global, sort of MSCI Wigby, um, uh, overall global asset prices, and also differences across asset prices and regional differences there. And I think critically, how does this affect the dollar as well?
Okay. Well, in one of the pieces I published about a month ago in the early part of March, I split the world into basically two camps. Those that had a pipeline for growth, which was, all of the home bias capex, the AI capex, plus fiscal stimulus in the pipeline, etc., versus the other camp, which were kind of pinning their hopes on central bank rate cuts in second and third quarter of this year to lift consumer sentiment, etc. So unfortunately, that second camp are going to lose out because we've got this energy shock, we've got this higher inflation to cope with now. So rate cuts as a catalyst for growth for the rest of the year are definitely not there, and that hurts certain countries more than others. On the other group, which has this pipeline of capex and fiscal stimulus, I feel like there's a big component of risk appetite that is necessary to keep that going. And this, ties back into our private, our private, credit and equity discussion from the last topic or last podcast. So, U.S. animal spirits remain high. The tech community very bullish. The AI pipeline is a generational thing, etc. But the broad economy is waiting for the trickle down, and it needs the risk appetite to stay high in order for that to happen. And I think if Q2 goes badly in terms of this narrative management and this transition to a maritime type of conflict that I've highlighted, then we lose that risk appetite support, and it becomes very rough sledding for the rest of the year, even for the U.S. U.S. wins out relatively, just as Japan does, and Korea does, and probably even Australia does, relative to the rest of the world. But it's a global recession type of relative outperformance, not a global growth story with relative outcomes. So that's why I think risk appetite is so important. I think validating that point, if you read the IMF GSFR this month when it came out, they were looking for channels into the emerging market flow from U.S. risk appetite. They sort of frame it as non-bank financial institutions have exported all this capital to the emerging markets, and it's very dependent on risk appetite. So I think they are flagging this risk as well. If we get a retrenchment in risk appetite, particularly in the U.S., then that's a hit to the steady flow of capital to private credit, private equity, and emerging markets, and that's how it becomes a global event. That feels like the transmission mechanism we're dealing with. So Q2 is really important. I wish I knew how well the Trump administration understands this point, because if they understand this point, and then they would definitely be following my playbook and downgrading the intensity of this conflict right away, regardless of what gains they wish they had made with the Iranian regime. But it really, Q2 needs to be a quarter of healing. The market needs that right now.
Okay, and then I mean the like the case of destruction um, uh, of Gulf assets. I mean, this isn't just a short-term thing. If you have significant destruction of Gulf oil production assets, this is a multi-year effect in terms of demand destruction. And how does that play out in your mind?
Well, that is a very negative, left tail that can happen. And only thing I would go back to is citing, the success rate so far of interception of incoming missiles and drones has been in the 90s and 90%. And the U.S., if it's not running its offensive bombing campaign, can
Well,
pivot.
let's not relitigate. Let's just talk about that scenario happens because they have actually been very accurate in their attacks as well. So yes, they've intercepted a lot, but they've also gotten a lot through, and they've been very accurate at what they've wanted to hit. So let's assume they can do that. What
Okay.
happens there for markets?
Well, I think that's a pretty easy scenario for everyone to understand. That's a global recession. That's a big, shock to the
How much
pricing.
does it blow back to the U.S. if the U.S. basically
Oh,
shuts down exports? Or sets a cap price on petroleum. You can't export anything unless it's above this cap or something like that. So that U.S. demand, U.S. prices are kept separate from the rest of the world.
Well, I think it's definitely a global recession because the energy prices are priced on a global level. Just because the U.S. has the source of supply, it's still being
No,
priced.
but you see what you could say you're only allowed to export to the rest of the world if prices in the U.S. are below there. So you have enough supply for the U.S. you actually do keep prices separate from the rest of the world. This is the way you can decouple the US from the rest of the world. There is a mechanism to do that. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I haven't ever seen the US do that.
Well, of course, but how many of the things in the Trump administration have you seen the
Well,
US?
like, I mean, Japan has done that. I mean, they're adding these subsidies to basically insulate consumers from the shocks, and even they can't do it well. I don't think the U.S. has the ability to insulate the household sector from the price shock. It can ensure that the supply is there, but not price. Whereas the rest of the world, it's going to be supply and price. So we will go into a global recession, and the global recession will impact risk appetite in the US, even though they're relatively better off. And the interruption in risk appetite, like I said, interrupts the flow into private credit, into private equity, and into emerging markets, etc. So you have a full equity market and recession correction, even though the US is in a relatively better position to stay. But I would argue that getting a few bombs through in Iran to take out a few water salination plants and a few refineries doesn't exactly equal that scenario. I think the US will be responding and the world will be responding because this is sort of Iran against the world. This is why the same case I make about the maritime story. When it's basically just protecting free sea lanes and protecting civilian infrastructure, and Iran is striking them, then it's just terrorism. And the world will respond collectively to that. It'll be painful, but I don't think Iran has the ability to sustain that kind of campaign either. So it's a
Okay.
horrible scenario. I just don't see it playing out to the full extent. We might get a taste of
How
it.
is the dollar reacting in these scenarios?
Well, in my dollar watch hour, I wrote that the dollar would get a reprieve from the ceasefire, which it did. But then, we're still stuck
But
in a,
why is that? That I think is a really important question. You know, the dollar rallied
yeah,
on this war, and
yeah.
then when you had the ceasefire and everyone thought, oh my gosh, they're going to stop it here. You know, the dominant narrative, everybody was convinced, oh my gosh, he is actually tacoing. We're going to get this war was entirely for nothing. Um, uh, that was basically what everybody was thinking, and it wasn't just in the press. Like everyone I was talking to in markets was like, "Oh my gosh, they're actually giving up here. This is a disaster." And the
Yeah.
dollar sold off because, in my view, that was a strategic. If you did that, that was a strategic disaster for the U.S.
Now, look, my framework has been arguing we have two offsetting flows. So we basically have an asset allocation flow away from US assets playing out very, very slowly. And then it was offset by a flight to quality flow during the conflict for the month of March. So as soon as there was a signal that the conflict was going to, ratchet down a few notches, then you take profit on those macro hedges because they're not bullish on the dollar. They don't want to buy more US assets. They're owning it as a precaution, as a macro hedge, etc. So those are not strong hands. Those are weak hands, and they got washed out. They had to react to a notional ceasefire in the same way that they would have reacted to like a concrete ceasefire, unfortunately. But it was only a 2 or 3 day trade, and then it's more or less over. So all of this is happening in the middle of the range. Same is true with equities. This is all happening in the middle of the range that we've had for the last, 6 months. So the prices can bounce around in the middle of the range without meaning that much. That's positioning. Strategic decisions have been delayed, and they're still being delayed until this resolution I'm describing. Q2 needs to be a reprieve from Q1. If it's not, strategic decisions are going to have to be taken.
So, I guess two questions for you on that. How would you differentiate your thesis from my thesis on the dollar? So how would you differentiate that this was purely just a risk off, and as soon as you had a ceasefire de-escalation, those got washed out from the idea that the underlying value of the dollar changes based on whether you see the U.S. as continuing its role as the clear hegemonic leader.
Mm. Well, okay, I thought you were going to say that it's leading the world in productivity and innovation because
Well,
that's your other thesis.
that's always been going on, and I've always said that's a key.
Yeah,
But there are as you know, I mean,
yeah.
you're one of the best currency managers that's ever lived, in my view. So, as you know, currency, one of the things that makes it so complicated is that so many different things go into it, but you know where I think we've both agreed is on one side the fundamentals about returns, risk adjusted returns in the US are clearly continuing to outperform the rest of the world. Hence, that should be a draw for capital into the US.
Yeah.
But the flip side is that there was this sort of political backlash concern that came at a time when you already have people very long the dollar to begin with that caused an asset allocation shift away. I don't actually disagree with that view. I think I've been there with you. But the other aspect that I think is really important is countering that asset allocation is as the world gets scarier, as it becomes clearer that the post-war liberal order doesn't exist anymore,
Mhm.
the one place that you feel most confident is going to continue to exist and is going to continue to play a leadership role in some sphere of influence, large sphere of influence in the economy, that is an attractive asset. That lowers the risk premium on that relative to everyone else, and so on a risk adjusted return, that's a better investment. So if the U.S. was strategically winning, let's just say, that I think you and I both see a grand strategy here that the Venezuela operation, if the Iran operation is successful, are effectively cementing the US in a position where it is very clearly leading some sort of coalition in the world.
Yeah.
Whereas, and so that's a positive for the dollar. Whereas, if it loses this war, if you end up with Iran rebuilding itself and the US having, trashed all its allies in the process, and by the way, that is the scenario where the GCC countries do flip to China, right? Because they then see that they can't, we got dragged into this and then they didn't even finish the job. Oh my gosh, we gotta hitch our wagons to China at that point. Then the US is very clearly a strategic loser here, in my view. And that is a negative thing. And this is what I heard a lot of people, including, hedge fund clients of mine, saying exactly this. This is what their concern was last week when the ceasefire was announced. Oh my gosh, they're giving up here. This is a disaster.
Mhm.
So how do you differentiate that version of the dollar from yours? Because they both go the same direction. They both explain the move. Which one? How would I? What's the test that I'm going to use to determine between your view and that view?
Well, you mix so many things in there. It's not possible for me to answer it succinctly now. But that like that last narrative you just mentioned, all due respect to whoever the hedge fund managers or you were speaking to, that didn't drive dollar response last week. So the dollar was not selling off last week because they thought US was losing and China was winning. They sold off precautionary holdings of dollar against a risk scenario that experienced some relief. So I won't say any more than that because I completely disagree with that scenario about U.S. losing. Like I didn't see the ceasefire in any shape or form as evidence that the U.S. is losing. So I expected the mainstream press to try to spin it that way. But I would have never expected, hedge fund managers and,
I think
experience.
you're we're obviously not going to have time to go off. I think you're misinterpreting. It's not that the U.S. is losing; it's that outcome. If the U.S. froze conditions there, that is a strategic loss
That's what
because
yeah, I
the
know.
Islamic Republic is still in power. It will rebuild all its missiles. It will rebuild its nuclear program, and all of this was for naught because all the U.S. did is piss off everyone else in the world.
Yeah, but you put up four fingers.
That is a strategic loss. I don't think there's any way to spin it any other way.
Yeah, but you hold up four
The
fingers. Only the first finger exists. The Islamic Republic government still standing. That's it. All the other stuff, not possible. If Iran couldn't rebuild its program when it was under a sanctions regime and the US was holding all of its assets in custody for a decade, how the hell is it going to rebuild now? Who's going to send fresh capital to Iran to rebuild its economy, let alone
China,
rebuild?
they did rebuild their missile flight in the last
Well,
6 months. So we
yeah,
actually have that as a
I don't
factual
think China
example.
will, because if the first structure they build gets bombed the next week and destroyed, whoever the investor is going to understand this isn't a very attractive investment strategy. So first of all, I just don't accept that thesis. But anyway, let's just keep it to be about the dollar. The dollar had two potential scenarios for breaking on the upside, which is the one that we have always backed, which is higher return on assets for the US, innovation and productivity. The US is the choice. And that had a potential for a breakout if we got beyond tariffs and 2026 was just all about the AI revolution playing out and strengthening the US economy over time. And so that one was curtailed as soon as the US prioritized foreign policy in Q1 rather than economics. The other breakout on the top side is the disaster scenario, the one that you flagged. If Iran decides to go out in a blaze of glory and just like dumps the rest of its inventory of bombs on its neighbors, and pushes the world into global recession, dollar breaks through the upside again on that one. So you got a positive and a negative one, just like the old dollar smile used to show you. And then the break on the downside is going back to some level of peace and stability with medium global growth, but U.S. outperformance and risk appetite high, so that exporting capital from the U.S. Comes back into play, and we have a downside trade through the range on that. The other part of the downside range is if there is some sort of political disaster between now and November, which implies that not only will the Republican Party lose the midterms, but the chance of one of Trump's successors, like Rubio or J.D. Vance, is also, shot down. Because then the market has to start to imagine how much of the current economic strategy gets interrupted by a swing back to the democratic strategy, which is very, very different in terms of what you would own in the stock market right now, for example. So those are the two scenarios for breaking on the downside versus the two scenarios breaking on the upside. At the moment, we have none of these. So this is why we're stuck in the range. I don't know if
Okay,
that
we're
makes
gonna
sense.
have to cut it off there. But this has been a useful
Good catch up, huh?
debate as usual. I think there are enough differences there that we're making a market between us. We can trade offline. Thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate you joining, and thanks to all our listeners and viewers for joining us and for your continued support.